Thank you very much. I'm excited to be here today. It's my first Ways of Whales workshop, and I'm having a lot of fun. My name is Erin Ashe, and I am a student, PhD student at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. I'm almost weeks away from not being a student. I'm finishing my PhD. I'm also co-founder and director of a nonprofit called Oceans Initiative. We are based in Washington State and in British Columbia, Canada, so we do most of our field work in Canada and other places in the world with my husband, Rob Williams. And today, as Howie mentioned, I'm going to speak to you about Pacific white-sided dolphins of the Salish Sea and also of the Broughton Archipelago up in British Columbia. But oops, I thought that was in advance. One moment. To set the stage a little bit, this is a photo. I think John had one when he was 16. So this is me when I think I'm about 5. I don't know, my mom would probably tell me. And this is looking out at Harrow Strait. My aunt lives on San Juan Island. So from an early age, I was hooked. I remember my aunt waking me up in the middle of the night to come outside and listen to the blows of the whales going by. So that inspired me. I thought, okay, I'm going to be a veterinarian, then a wildlife veterinarian, and then I don't know if any of you know Joe Gatos from Sea Doc Society, but he quickly steered me into really what I wanted to do was be a conservation biologist. And I was fortunate to have great support, and I got my start at Cascadia with John Kalumbakidis, and later began working on measuring behavioral responses of killer whales to boat traffic, both in the San Juan Islands and in British Columbia. This is Johnstone Strait, where John Durbin was just speaking about. And that is home of one of the world's only killer whale marine protected area. It's a great spot to have some experimental controls. And I just like this little map, the Isle of Charm. It is a charming place. So Johnstone Strait is up here near a little town called Alert Bay. And this is where my husband Rob built a field cabin 10, 15 years ago. And it's an inexpensive place to work. We have a little small boat and we go out, and it's a fascinating ecosystem. There are grizzly bears and obviously killer whales, stellar sea lions, harbor porpoise, we were just speaking about those. But Alert Bay is known as the home of the killer whale. And I was so thrilled to go there my first time. I thought, this is killer whale mecca, this is going to be amazing. But on my first trip, I didn't see any killer whales. Instead, I saw this, and it was essentially a wall of water. And Rob and I were out on the boat, and I said, what on earth is that? And he said, oh, those are lags. And at the time, this is 10, 15 years ago, I was too embarrassed to say, what on earth are lags? And it's not surprising that I didn't have that in the back of my pocket. Lags is a shorthand for Lagonorhynchus, and that's the genus name of Pacific white-sided dolphins. And we don't know a lot about oceanic dolphins generally, and what was even more surprising was to find pelagic dolphins in inshore waters. This is a lovely illustration by Ugo Gorder. Many of you know him, and a neat photograph by John Kalumbakidis taken offshore. You can see there with Lizadelphus there. They often swim together. And these dolphins are often seen in groups of 1,000, sometimes over 3,000. So it makes it challenging to count every one. We can't go through and have an accounting of each animal. So historically, folks have carried out line transect surveys to estimate how many dolphins there are and where they are. And if you can see, get my laser here, the blue here represents the predicted range of white-sided dolphins. And then all the colored squares are places where we have data. So you can see, we're doing somewhat of a good job in certain places, and other places we have no data at all. And about 20 years ago, one survey estimated close to 1 million dolphins in the whole North Pacific. But you can see that the catch here is that the estimate's plus or minus 90%, which is not at all approaching what we have for killer whales. Southwest Fisheries Science Center does an amazing job, and 60,000 dolphins, doing a little better. And then Rob carried out some line transect surveys in British Columbia and estimated about 25,000 dolphins. And with these numbers, they're obviously an abundant species, so at this point, there's not a conservation concern. But a funny thing happened in the early 1990s. Many of you may be familiar with Alexandra Morton. She set up a field camp in the Broughton Archipelago, which is near Johnstone Strait, in the late 80s, and began studying killer whales there. And after fish farms moved in, to reduce the chance of fish farms being impacted by seals and other animals, some acoustic harassment devices were installed. And at that point, the residents left the area and they haven't returned to the Broughton Archipelago. But what did come back were white-sided dolphins. And it looked as though it was sort of a recolonization of the area. So Alexander started collecting photographs and identification photographs, because that's what you do. That's how everyone in this area has been taught. And it turned out that it was possible to identify individuals. And we use the term recolonization because although people hadn't seen dolphins when you interviewed fishermen and people who had been living in the area for years, no one remembered these animals being in this region. But some archaeological evidence suggests that these dolphins have been in the area and possibly thousands of years ago. And we're seeing maybe a similar story here in the Salish Sea, a little bit farther south. And this has been going on again since the early 1990s. We have a match between Alexandra's catalog and Robin Baird photographically captured a dolphin off of Victoria a month apart. And I should mention here, the reason I bring up Alexandra Morton is because as she became focused on the fish farming issue, what was going on in her region, she kindly handed her 25 years of dolphin photo identifications to me so that I could conduct an analysis. So the recent visits to Howe Sound and Salish Sea may be, again, an indication of a recolonization going on. But at this point, we don't know whether it's a distribution shift or an increase in their population. But certainly, you can see from the Orca Sightings Network, this was something I did years and years ago when I just started investigating white-sided dolphins. And you can see that reports have certainly gone up, and I think many of you may just know instinctually, yes, I've seen dolphins in my inbox a lot more often than I used to. So going back to the photo identification, as many of you know, it was pioneered in the 1970s by Michael Bigg for killer whales. And in the 1990s, there was a special issue at the IWC called Individual Recognition of Cetaceans, which is just now holds the classic papers by Bigg and Ford and Balcom and Kalmakidis and Alexandra Morton. And my PhD supervisor pioneered some statistical methods to estimate cetacean abundance from photo identification. So now that Alexandra kindly handed over her data. I combined her data and then set out on my own well, not all on my own, but to collect additional photographs of dolphins to assess the population health and status. But I also wanted to look at whether there was population structure. Maybe there was something similar to killer whales where there's a resident and a transient population. Also look at what factors may be influencing survival. I mentioned that conservation status as it stands now isn't a concern, but maybe we could identify if there are threats now and stop them before they do become a problem. So I went from the home of the killer whale to the home of golf, which is the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. And people often say that it's really strange that you went all the way to Scotland. But there's this really neat relationship where statisticians and biologists work together to really come up with cutting-edge methods to look at cetacean conservation and marine mammals generally. So again, as we learned, can't count every dolphin, so we need to use statistics. And these methods are well established with humpback whales and blue whales and any cetacean for which you can't count every one. And it's a simple idea where you have a record of individual dolphins and you follow them through time, just like the killer whales example. So here's an example of one of our dolphins called Wilson. And for the other challenge with working with white-sided dolphins is that you may only see some of these animals once or twice. You're not likely to see them every single year. And so that adds another layer of complexity. And this is a map of our study area where we're based here and went into the Broughton Archipelago here and up into an inlet. And as far as I know, I think technically the Salish Sea starts in Butte Inlet down here. So we're kind of on the border of the Salish Sea right there. And here's an example of photograph Alexandra Morton took in the early 2000s, and I photographed the same animal 11 years later in the same location. And again, we do have matches between the Broughton Archipelago area and the Salish Sea region. So how many dolphins are there? That was a burning question. Well, I found that it varies widely from year to year and also from winter to summer. But the good news on my end was that a little over half of the adult dolphins are well marked, so I can actually identify over half of them. Some of them have rather generic plain fins, so it's difficult to be able to reliably follow them each year. They don't have very clear saddle patches. Like the killer whales are really looking at fine nicks and notches. And we can find that we'll have anywhere from 3,000 to just a few hundred in any given year, so it's highly variable. I also looked at the probability of survival for an average adult dolphin. Again, these estimates seem to be quite variable. And my initial estimates were lower than expected. And then if I just restrict to the winter months, interestingly, we have a higher survival estimate. So it sort of depends on which dolphins you're including in the analysis here. And this brings us to, in terms of survival, looking at babies and how well is this population doing, how well are they reproducing. And it's very interesting that there were no calves observed in this area until 1995. And now we see newborns regularly in the summer months. In July and August, it's a virtual nursery ground way up in the protected inlets. And through the photo identification data I collected, I was able to estimate that dolphins have calves about every 4 years, and this is what was predicted from life history information previously, but it was nice to confirm that. I was also interested in what kind of social structure, if anything, the dolphins may have. And we have preliminary evidence that white-sided dolphins are highly social animals. They form strong bonds that last over time, and something on par with pilot whales. This was a little bit surprising, but on the other hand, not completely so, because we do have photographic evidence of this example. One pair of dolphins seen together 17 years apart, and the odds of detecting something like that are quite low, which means this sort of long-term association may be a true signal in the data, but we do, as I point out here, we do need more data to confirm this. And here's an example of sort of a social network where we see clusters here and then a few little outgroups here. And this leads us to think about looking at the level of the population. If you think back to the map of the North Pacific, the Pacific white-sided dolphins are all lumped together as generic Pacific white-sided dolphins. And knowing what we know now about killer whales, we would never say this is an entire generic population of killer whales. We look at them as individual populations, so we know when the southern residents are in trouble versus the northern residents that are maybe their population is increasing. It's important to have that delineation so we can closely monitor the health of the individual populations. At this stage, we don't have a lot of information about population structure within white-sided dolphins. But we know that there's a lower than expected survival estimates for some of the models. And what the question is now, does that survival estimate apply to all dolphins or just a specific population? And at this stage, we know that the genetic evidence points to some population structure, some differentiation between dolphins in California versus dolphins in British Columbia. And in fact, there's some genetic and acoustic evidence to suggest that there are two different populations of dolphins in Southern California. And that's being investigated further. So, with the killer whale model in mind, we know that residents and transients sound quite different. And that was a line of evidence I was interested in following through with the Pacific white-sided dolphins to see whether there was any acoustic evidence to suggest there were two populations. So I'm going to play a little example of dolphin call. So it's much higher frequency than killer whales. And the other big predictor for killer whales, of course, is diet. We've been talking a lot about salmon here today. For Pacific white-sided dolphins, we see the herring plays a large role in their diet. They do eat salmon on occasion. And that work was done by Kathy Heisey. And there seems to be somewhat of a seasonal pattern to what they choose to forage on. And this is something I'm exploring in future. But here's an example of some foraging strategies on herring. The dolphins work together as in a coordinated group to exploit these amazing herring balls that form in Johnson Strait in the Broughton. And to be able to coordinate in this way, it does make sense that there may be some strong social bonds going on. And while we're talking about diet, white-sided dolphins form part of the diet for transient or big killer whales. You can see here some evidence of killer whale predation attempts on dolphins. This is something that's rarely seen, but I'll play a video for you. This again has an example of what the dolphins sound like. And this is in Night Inlet. We were on a typical photo identification excursion, photographing dolphins, and it was quite a large group. And at a certain point, we saw an individual dolphin repeatedly engaging in this behavior where it was reaching out of the water and slapping hard down on the surface, which made a loud sound. And eventually, all of the dolphins, all at once, started heading towards shore. And we thought we'd done something terribly, terribly wrong. But then we saw this. And the killer whales proceeded to essentially corral the dolphins into a very small, narrow bay. And the dolphins continued to go towards shore. And this dolphin sadly did die. We were able to collect some samples to pass on to DFO. And you can still see some of the dolphins essentially heading into the trees. And from conversations with other mariners and researchers in this area, sometimes the dolphins end up on the beach, and sometimes it's more than one. You can have groups of 5 or 7, so terrified that they end up stranding themselves. So although they're not dying from predation itself, they're dying from, it's sort of like a killer whale bycatch scenario. And we suspect this could be having some effect on their survival. Again, this is preliminary evidence, but when you look at the number of killer whales number of killer whale days, this is from Paul Spong and Helena Simons at Orca Lab. They were kind enough to share their longitudinal data dating back to the early 90s. You see that the number of killer whale days does seem to have some sort of link with dolphin survival. And again, it could be obviously being eaten affects your survival, but also this intentional stranding response, the behavioral response itself. And then we saw earlier that some of the dolphins have these really intense wounds, and we don't really know what the long-term effects of those are yet. So again, here's the example of that fresh killer whale wound. And about 4% of adult identifiable dolphins have these scars. And this pattern of this behavioral pattern that we see, again, is something that seems to be stereotyped. Whenever you speak to someone who's witnessed an attack, they'll convey the same story in many in inshore waters, especially. And another issue that comes up a lot is you often see Pacific white-sided dolphins harassing killer whales. The resident killer whales are jumping all over them, and the killer whales seem really, really annoyed with this. And we're not sure why they do that. It may just be play. But one theory may be that it's a form of predator inspection to find out sort of who your enemy is and size them up. And we're speaking about killer whale, essentially killer whale bycatch of white-sided dolphins. But in the oceanic realm, white-sided dolphins were subjected to high seas drift net fishery, and many of them, over hundreds of thousands of them, died in the 70s and 80s. Fortunately, this practice has been banned, but unfortunately, illegal drift netting still occurs. And luckily, in British Columbia, a study that CDOC supported and that Rob Williams and colleagues carried out, doesn't seem that bycatch is a problem for these dolphins in British Columbia, which is great news. The observer coverage isn't complete by any means, so there may be places that we're missing where it is a problem, so it's certainly something to keep on the radar. But it's good news that they're not being hammered in any particular fishery. It's same with in Alaska and in California. So, and in Mexico, we're not sure what the bycatch impact is. But we do see injuries, which may be killer whale, or it may be an interaction with fisheries locally. When I interviewed veterinary pathologists to get their assessment on certain injuries that I was seeing in these photographs, many of them said that this type of injury is consistent with a fisheries injury, but it's something we need to investigate further. And there are some reports of dolphins being caught in seine nets. In fact, 25 were caught all at once during a test fishery from DFO in the 90s. The interesting aspect of that incident, though, is they were almost all males. So that, again, is a clue into their social structure. And there are some reports of dolphins being entangled in the anti-predator nets in the fish farms. But it seems that that's rare, and I think that it's on the decrease now because there are efforts that have been quite successful in getting better monitoring with the predator nets and best practices with the anti-predator nets. And many of you are probably aware that white-sided dolphins are taken in the Taiji drive hunts. Many of you have probably seen the Cove and are well aware of this. This is Scott Baker with his neat portable genetics laboratory where he's able to go into meat and fish markets to assess whether the labeling is correct for many of the meats that are sold. So what are the next steps here? I have a new field assistant, so it's changing things a little bit. I'm going to investigate further the impact of killer whales on dolphin behavior, their abundance, and their survival. I'm really interested in looking at dolphin health in terms of direct health in terms of disease, and I'm partnering with some veterinary pathologists to investigate that. We like to take a transboundary approach. The dolphins are transboundary themselves, so that makes sense. And long-term data sets, as I've discovered, and as we know from the killer whale example, are extraordinarily valuable. So it's important that this work continues for that reason. And given the changes, we're going to need a bigger boat. And now, after John's talk, I really, really want a hexacopter. We have future opportunities here to expand our work in the Salish Sea through photo ID and acoustics. Dolphins are really interesting. The Lagnarhynchus genus itself is fascinating, or at least I think it is, and I think it's neat enough. We're hopefully hosting a workshop at the Marine Mammal Conference to look at conservation status, genetics, acoustics, etc., because it looks as though they may not belong in this genus at all. They may be moving to a new genus, maybe not in the near future, but at some point. So there's lots of fascinating work to be done. And I wanted to thank all of you for your attention today, and to Orca Network for inviting me. It was really a pleasure to be here today. Thank you very much.